big topics, big ideas, and practical policy solutions. This is Leaders on the Frontier with your host, David Lease.
Hi, everybody. It's David Lease here. I'm your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier, and a warm welcome to all of you for joining us on Thursday, October the 17th. It's hard to believe how, I don't know about you, but sometimes it seems like time flies, and such is the fall season, and I hope you've had very meaningful Thanksgiving. We can be very thankful for many good things, and I notice Prairie has said good afternoon, and good afternoon to you, and we're so glad that you can join us as an audience, and Matt says good afternoon as well. It's always interesting how so many people across the country and certainly around the world join us for these kinds of discussions, and we really do appreciate it. And because today, in the aftermath of Thanksgiving, we pause and reflect on not only what we're grateful for in our lives, but for our country. And as we look then to November, certainly Remembrance Day, we remember our country in many different ways, including the sacrifices that people made for our country to come together. And thank you, Colleen, for your kind comment. Hello to two of my favorite guys. Well, that's very kind. But thank you so much, everybody, because when we look at today, we're going to talk about one of the incredible strengths of our nation, and that is democracy. We have some very important elections coming up in three incredible provinces in BC. It's this Saturday on October the 19th. And then the next provincial election is in New Brunswick on October 21. And then, of course, Saskatchewan on October 28th. So we're going to dive into each one of those. But I did want to share with you a few highlights before we dive into this with our special guest, Nigel Hannaford from the Western Standard. And a couple things. One is, you may have noticed that in the headlines, we've had a lot about the RCMP, talking about foreign interference. It certainly would be great to have a real conversation about what are the facts and evidence regarding foreign interference. And there's really quite an interesting story. But I thought I'd share with you, as you know, I'm very much have a strong interest in history in Canada. And it's fascinating. I came across this the other day. Do you know what the official motto is for the RCMP? Well, it's not "we always get our man." It's actually "uphold the right." Did you hear that? Uphold the right. That sounds great. That phrase can be traced back to an article that appeared in Fort Benton, Montana Record in April of 1877. The mounted police are worse than bloodhounds when they catch the track of a smuggler, and they fetch their man every time. So that's where that phrase, "they always get their man," came from. So it was interesting. Fort Benton was the main supply depot for the whiskey traders who were smuggling liquor into Canada. Well, who knew? But the motto for the RCMP is "uphold the right." And so isn't that important to keep that in mind? So we're really delighted to hear that. You may have noticed as well some other things in the headlines, which are very interesting. You may have noticed that, I think it just came out yesterday, there's an interesting poll regarding the rising cost of living is changing people's habits in Canada. It's quite a harsh reality. Canadians are making tough choices to manage the high cost of living, with half, or specifically 51%, reportedly changing their spending behavior to make ends meet and save money, according to a survey by Insolvency Practice MNP. So are your purchasing habits changing? I know I have bumped into all kinds of people, as you have in the grocery store, who say, wow, I really have changed my buying habits. So this is a big deal. And so there's lots of other headlines, and we'll kind of go through them. So when we talk today about those elections in BC, New Brunswick, and Saskatchewan, we'll also dive into a little bit about the whole issue of federal politics because there's a kind of a crossover of sorts between the provincial and federal elections. And so I'm really delighted today to have a very special guest join us. You may have seen his discussions throughout, a number of years in Canadian politics. He's a brilliant speechwriter and journalist, and his name is Nigel Hannaford, and he's with the Western Standard. So I want to welcome Nigel to our program, and a warm welcome to you, my friend, Nigel Hannaford.
Well, thank you for having me. All those words
Well,
of praise, I hope I can justify them.
okay. Well, it's an honor to have you, Nigel, because you are obviously very knowledgeable about the political scene in Canada. And so we're delighted to have you because, as an audience, we can. It'll be exciting to see what they think in terms of questions, and they can pose them to the great Nigel Hannaford. So, Nigel, if you don't mind me asking, can you tell us more about how you got involved in this grand political process, this tradition that we've inherited, that we can actually have a democracy and the freedom to discuss important issues and actually elect people that we think can then govern? How did you get involved in the political process?
Yes, it's when you put it like that, it is a bit surprising. I did take a degree in politics, but I spent the first 6 years of my professional career in the trucking industry, both on both sides of the counter, so to speak. And when I came to Canada, I entered journalism up in Fort St. John in northeastern BC. Had a succession of experiences there that 25 years later left me in Calgary, and it was there I became very involved with a number of people who were prominent in conservative politics, and eventually asked me to go to Ottawa and work as a speechwriter. But long before that, I had been thinking, what's wrong with this situation? What's wrong with that situation? And trying to go back to first principles and analyze it. Here we are. Now we're running opinion in the Western Standard. Telling the
Well,
world
I
what's right and wrong.
it's really great to see you because you have a lot of incisive insight into many of the political issues going on today. And I guess we're going to talk about three provincial elections and some of the headlines as well that are bubbling around our nation. Do you think, though, that Canadians tend to take our democratic rights and freedoms for granted as we're kind of now turning towards Remembrance Day?
I'm not sure that they take them for granted, but they don't take much notice of what their leaders, the leaders they've chosen, are doing between elections. And it is unfortunate because sometimes the things are being done that people actually wouldn't have voted for, but they're not aware of them and they're not following it in the newspapers. They've got other things to worry about. You see, there's two different headsets that are going on. You've got the conservative way of thinking of things, and you have the progressive left wing. The progressive left wing is always active, always wants to do something. For whatever reason. I mean, it's not always that they're mean or malicious. Sometimes there is such a thing as a genuine good cause.
Hmm.
However, conservatives have a different view. They elect somebody to go to the legislature, to go to parliament, and just take care of business for them and leave them alone. They don't want to do politics on a daily basis. On the left, that's what people like to do in their spare time. There is a maxim in life that the rules are made by the people who show up, and the people who show up tend to be on the left. And then every 4 years, the conservative side of the population thinks, wait a minute, this is terrible. I didn't vote for this. And then they become interested for just long enough to replace the other side. And then they go back to what they do, which is the things that interest them.
I think, Nigel, you're onto something here. You've just spelled out, in many ways, kind of a great divide, and I don't mean that in a kind of a hostile way or a conflict way, but it's a different way of looking at life between those people who kind of want to get, if I'm understanding your point, there's a divide of people who simply want to get on with their lives. They work every day. They're caught up. They want to be left alone, as you kind of allude to, and others that just want to be in politics every day and they want to use the state to kind of build a better quote world or utopia, depending on what nightmare you're looking at. But those
David,
are very different
there's
views.
some sociological evidence for this. It's old research now, 70 or 80 years ago, but it came out just after the war. And there was a book published called The Authoritarian Personality. And without going into a lot of detail,
Yes,
of the author and his views, he determined that there was roughly 1/3 of the population, any population, that had a desire to interfere with the lives of the other two. And so I think that there really is, as you say, two separate realities, people who want to interfere and keep interfering, and others who just want to be left alone. Unfortunately,
isn't that
when
interesting?
you're being left alone, you tend not to take any notice of what's being done behind your back.
Well, I like the way you think, Nigel. It's interesting. In a prior conversation, I had the privilege of joining you on your program a few weeks ago,
Yes, thank you for
and
that.
thank you. And I think I referred to the phrase "the good and the great," people who somehow think they are righteous or wise enough or kind of know it that they can somehow manage the lives of other people. Is that kind of another way to say it? Is that what you're getting at?
Oh, all goes together. I mean, obviously, you have to have a great deal of self-confidence in the way you think and what you believe to say, those people over there who don't think like I do should be made to think like I do and act in a manner that is pleasing to me, because my way is better. I actually think that we have a model for that in our federal government.
Yeah, I agree. So this is maybe an important kind of principle or plumb line. When you build a structure, you need to do plumb lines to make sure you've got everything straight up and narrow. But you have, I think, a very important principle, a lens, if you will, to look at a lot of the issues that are going on, certainly in all these elections and certainly what's going on the federal scene. So on that note, Nigel, I did want to tap into your wisdom and expertise here. And again, this is not through a partisan lens per se. It's really through kind of that wisdom of insight that we just talked about. But we've noticed the recent headline. It's really quite amazing. But the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition are now trading charges over foreign interference. In fact, you've got, as we know, there's been real concerns in this nation about foreign interference that has been documented to some degree, but in many respects, we're just kind of touching the tip of the iceberg. But it's amazing. I think it was yesterday that the Prime Minister actually said there are several current and former Conservative parliamentarians are either engaged in or targets of foreign interference, as he lambasted the federal Conservative leader for refusing to get top-level security clearance. And then in response to that, the leader of the opposition accused Trudeau of frankly lying and called on him to release the redacted names of parliamentarians alleged by the review committee to have wittingly or unwittingly acted on behalf of a foreign country. So what are we to make of this? Like, what the heck is going on here? Like, surely we want to have discussions that are based on evidence and facts, not hearsay. And why is this coming out now, Nigel? What's your hypothesis?
Well, I think what you're looking at is the desperate flailings of a prime minister who's going to lose his next election. If present polls are any indication, there is a general disgust and a general tiredness of Mr. Trudeau, who nevertheless believes that he can still pull his chestnuts out of the fire if he's just given more time. Now, the kind of thing that we're talking, the specific allegation, there's two sets of specific allegations in two countries that are involved, that there was electoral interference by agents of the government of China, I think has now been established beyond any reasonable doubt. The other one is the government of India, which if you accept the Prime Minister's narrative, has sent criminal gangs to kill people who are hostile to the government of India. And this is a terrible thing, and we must all get excited about it. What used to happen over the decades is that these kinds of things would be worked out between the respective security agencies of the two countries involved. We're talking about Sikh extremism here. Sikh extremism has been around for more than 40 years. You'll recall that in 1985, Sikh extremists operating out of Canada, Canadian citizens, in fact, actually conspired to bomb an Air India aircraft, which did indeed crash with 329 people aboard. So the fears of the Indian government that activists dedicated to carving out a piece of India to set up a new country called Khalistan, something that they would take great note of. The same group of people also assassinated an Indian Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi. Excuse me. So they're not worrying about nothing. Now, we don't have those kinds of threats in Canada at this time, so we take a rather dispassionate view of it and wish perhaps that the Indians would not be so brazen, but they probably feel about the activists who want a free Khalistan very much the way the Israeli government feels about activists who, want from the river to the sea. So we're kind of caught in the middle, but like I said, in times gone by, this kind of thing was kept below the surface of public reporting because it is so dangerous to get passions worked up. Well, here we are with a Prime Minister who is looking at defeat, and he needs an issue. And there are votes to be had in the Sikh community in Canada, which is quite large. I think they're 2% of the population, so they certainly have, I believe, they have elected 15 Sikh members to the Canadian Parliament of 338 members. So, 2% of the population is contributing 4% of the members of Parliament is quite a substantial influence that group of people has, and their votes are prized in constituencies which can turn on hundreds rather than thousands in the majorities. So it would appear, in my interpretation, that Mr. Trudeau has chosen to take this issue and make himself the champion of it, all in the name of Canadian patriotism. We can't have other countries interfering in Canada, even though when it was the Chinese, he was much less vocal. And so there you have it. It's a highly contrived situation. It wouldn't normally be dealt with like this.
Okay, so that's I think a wise insight, but clearly we do need to get at the bottom of these things, but in a way that frankly doesn't play to I know some have called it diaspora politics. Diasporas are being like a reference to the number of communities that have come out of certain countries with highly charged, highly emotional aspirations regarding independence. Like, you referred to the Sikh community in Canada, which plays a very important role in our country, as well as other nations. So we don't want to, quote, import those types of conflicts into Canada, because obviously that would create a real mess in many respects. So, and yet it seems like this is being used for domestic political purposes. So that's a pretty dangerous game, is it not, Nigel?
Well, it is, and it isn't always the game that we played. When we first started to open up the country to immigration in the 1960s, it was a very difficult thing to get a pass into Canada. There was a grading system where you had to be able to speak English or French, and you got points for that. And then you had to have a degree, and you got points for that. I mean, I know this is the process that I went through. But that was the 60s and the 70s. And then as a means to appeal to ethnic politics again, I guess, but as a means of appealing to people who had already made the move. The progressive conservative governments in the late 70s, and Flora MacDonald comes to mind as the author of this, started as immigration minister, established a family reunion policy. So if the son was here, he could bring his aged parents to Canada and they would make it easy for you. So at this point, you have gone from taking only the world's best and brightest to taking the world's best and brightest and their closest relatives. Now, from a human point of view, it's hard to object to that. But as the circle of acceptance grew, the family, it became the cousins and the cousins' sons. And you can trace the progress of immigrant communities in Canada over the decades and see that those who arrived in the 60s and the 70s did very well. They were high on the socioeconomic standing. Your doctors, your lawyers, they made a lot of money and established themselves and integrated themselves into Canadian society because that's what they came for. They were wanting something different to what they were leaving behind. Well, as more people who came in who weren't necessarily at that level of intellectual or economic prowess came in, the whole thing became diluted, and you would see studies coming out from reputable organizations. I don't know whether the Frontier Center ever touched this, but certainly a number of them did. And the economic outcomes weren't so good for first generation immigrants. And then what you've seen in relatively recent years during the Trudeau administration is basically open the doors, anybody can come. In fact, Mr. Trudeau said something, those were not his exact words, but I think seeking to score a point off President Trump, whose views on immigration, or especially illegal immigration, are well known. Mr. Trudeau, sometime in 2016, said something along the lines of, well, Canada's a welcome country, people should come here. Well, they did. But we seem to have lost the ability to vet them, and there certainly is no ticking off of these boxes to showing the reasons why you actually deserve to have a little pink pass to get you into Canada.
Indeed. I think what you're really challenging all of us to do, including the government of this day, to manage this important portfolio, this important policy portfolio of immigration to the interests of a nation, not just simply for the short-term, dare I say, cynical interests of a political party. So that, I think, is a very important reminder, Nigel. It's interesting, we have some questions or points made by our audience. One of them is from Prairie. I think most of us see it for what it was intended for, and that is distraction. I suspect you're right on. You're with that comment, Prairie. I mean, part of this is the context, quite frankly, over the weekend, as the Prime Minister returned from a trip, yet another one from an international location. I think it was Laos, I believe. That there's a internal caucus revolt brewing. I think we've heard a number of statements from MPs calling for, within his own party, his resignation. So that puts a lot of pressure on this government to turn the channel, so to speak. Is that right, Nigel?
Well, I'm not sure that it is. You could certainly make that argument, but Mr. Trudeau is in a fairly strong position for a number of reasons. First of all, when he came to power in 2015, he gradually removed all of the usual checks and balances that surround a Liberal prime minister. So, for example, he disbanded the Liberal caucus in the Senate, called them independents. I notice they tend to follow the government line fairly well, but strictly speaking, they're not part of the apparatus anymore. The regional, different provinces, different parts of provinces tend to have a regional strongman, somebody who's, they're often called party lieutenants. And those guys are were basically kneecapped so that they couldn't mount an effective opposition to anything that the Prime Minister's office said. MPs themselves were, something very interesting happened. All the old stagers, the people who had been around for a few years, understood the parliamentary ways of compromise, were put on the back benches and very quickly left government because there was nothing for them to do. Their experience was not being used. And so the Prime Minister cherry-picked candidates who he was simpatico with and who would be loyal to him personally. I mean, without picking on people in an unkind way, if your background is from something totally disrelated to politics, you scaled Mount Everest or you won an Olympic gold medal, well, you become a star candidate and your loyalties are not to the Liberal Party, your loyalties are to the Prime Minister who chose you and endorsed you and signed your nomination papers. So he's been able to do what he's been doing for a long time simply because there aren't too many people in a position to tell him no. Now you come to what you're talking about, where you have, I think the last count, it was 23 members of Parliament, Liberal members of Parliament are supposed to be withdrawing their backing from him. Well, gentlemen and ladies, perhaps, if you wish to withdraw your support for the Prime Minister, withdraw it.
Mm-hmm.
What is this? Why are we messing around like this? And I think the reason that they don't withdraw it is they would like Mr. Trudeau to go away quietly and leave them to where their pensions will mature in October of 2025. They may have a slightly better chance of winning their seats. What will now happen, of course, that Mr. Trudeau has the perfect opportunity to put them in their place. It's all right, if that's how you feel. Let's go to an election now. You worried you're going to lose in a year? You could lose right now, and let's get this over with. Or are we going to have less of this kind of subversive talk? I'm the boss, and I'm going for another year, and you're coming with me.
All right. Well said. So I'm having a conversation, or we are, as an audience, with Nigel Hannaford with the Western Standard. Nigel, you've seen a lot in terms of different systems, including the federal one, and I think that's a very, how do you say, you're giving us reality therapy on the position of power that the Prime Minister has and how he has certainly fashioned it around his own personal relationships and not really within the kind of traditions, the parliamentary traditions that have served our country so well. So I think that's a brilliant insight that gives us some perspective on this so-called revolt that is happening. So stay tuned on that one. We have a lot of questions that are bubbling up here, and that is terrific. So I do want to turn to just a footnote on immigration, because there was a poll just released, I believe it was yesterday, but nearly 2/3 of Canadians believe there are too many immigrants currently in the country, according to a new national poll. The survey was conducted by Leger for the Association of Canadian Studies and suggests an emerging national consensus on the matter. So that's a very interesting background according to that very important policy file. So let's turn to the elections, and I want to get to the first one, which is in BC, October 19, this Saturday. So there's a kind of a lens that we can look at this, Nigel, and I know that you know these provinces pretty well, but if we think about all the key issues, I mean, there's a kind of a raft of kind of the similar ones around affordability, the economy. We've got particular issues in each area. But when you look at BC, we've got a fascinating, it's a complex reemergence of a renewed BC Conservative Party and the incumbent party, the NDP. So what's your thumbnail sketch on what's happening in BC?
I would say that what's happening in BC has its echoes of what's happening across the country, including Alberta, where we're not facing an election, and Saskatchewan, where we are, and in New Brunswick, in Ontario, where people are starting to realize, I'm taking you back to the beginning of this conversation, that they can't look away forever. they may suddenly find that something very serious has been done behind their backs. And I'm thinking of all of those issues that fall under the umbrella of wokeism. And the most obvious front and center one is sexuality, and it has become necessary. And it was actually Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick who was the first premier to follow the necessity, but to just say, look, maybe we don't mind what people do, but we do mind that children don't make those kinds of decisions until they're old enough, at least, to drive or to buy liquor. I mean, how can it be that a human being has to wait until 18 before they can vote, but if the activists had their way, would decide to have chemical castration and reorganization of their body at the age of 13? Clearly, something is not right about that, but that's what happens when you take your eye off what's going on right there in your own school. So I think, as I said, Blaine Higgs in New Brunswick was the first premier to land on that one. But then Scott Moe in Saskatchewan took the same position. Danielle Smith in Alberta took the same position. And in BC, I noticed John Rustad is also calling for caution and in fact, for restraint in those areas. Well, that's just one aspect of wokeism that happens to be front and center and most popular. It's that general feeling, it's the general attitude that somehow everybody's a victim and you can't call them out on that because that would be unkind, and you end up getting silly outcomes. Now, I'm bringing you back to BC for a silly outcome. The drug policy adopted by the government of British Columbia was known as safe supply. And the idea was, and this is a woke idea, that people are victims and we need to save lives. So people are dying because they're using dirty needles and drugs of unknown power because, I mean, they're prepared in criminal circumstances. Who knows what you're smoking? So therefore, we must offer them safe drugs and safe places to consume them, and then they won't die. And most people think, what? And then we've started to see the effects. The first effect, of course, was that the pure drugs found their way onto the black market in a flash. And the second was that because these people were designated as victims, they enjoyed preference in ways you would never have predicted. So an addict would end up in hospital for something, and because he needed his fix, he would not only be allowed to have it in hospital, but also in some hospitals, medical staff were directed to prepare the drug for his consumption. So you've got a nurse fixing up a crack pipe to give to somebody who's in a ward under her care. Now, this is just stupidity writ large. And yet the NDP in BC believed in it, advocated it, funded it, and finally, only when facing an election against somebody like Rustad, who was prepared to call it what it was, stupidity, finally backed away and said, well, we need something else. All this there is another way in Alberta. They don't do that. The idea is to catch people and treat them. It's expensive. It's unrewarding because there's a lot of recidivism. But in Alberta, they try to keep people alive through treatment, not by feeding the habit that's eventually going to kill them anyway. So my first, you asked me what was what stood out about the BC election. One of the things is the rejection of wokeism that I think is starting to find its way through the common sense part of the population and into the voting booth, and the drug one was the first.
Okay, so I think that's a very interesting take then on BC, that election, but it's kind of like a lens for the whole country in every province, is you're saying basically these elections are kind of like a seminal fork in the road where people are looking at these policies that have been implemented that don't seem to be grounded or in reality or working. And because a lot of these policies have been implemented through that kind of woke lens, and we can explore more about what that means exactly, but this constant drumbeat of the oppressor versus the oppressed. So if you look at, well, let's just look at the kind of the list of issues. We've got the carbon tax to somehow stop the, quote, environmental crisis. You've got the need for healthcare reform. You've got the issues of taxation. You've got the issues of violent crime. You've got this whole called safe supply philosophy that has been a train wreck. You've got supporting parents to do the parenting of their children, not the woke school system. So that's kind of it goes full circle to the key point that you made at the very beginning of the conversation, Nigel, that we've got kind of a divide in our country between those people who want to be empowered and left alone to live their lives versus others who want to insert government power using kind of woke principles to run your life. Is that kind of a lens? Am I being too simplistic here?
No, you're not. That is exactly how it is. Perhaps the only modification to what I said earlier was that sometimes there is something that needs to be done. You know, if we had conditions similar to the mid-19th century, where children were employed in factories, I wouldn't call it woke if somebody said maybe we should have an age limit and children below a certain age shouldn't be in school and not in factories. That is a social good. It probably looked outrageous to people in the 1850s, but I don't think any of us would make the case that we should go back to a system where industry relied upon child labor. That said, the issue of child labor was one that could be considered on its merits and found wanting, whereas I don't know how you look at safe supply and say that is something that should be extended, or would you look at the premature chemical castration of children and say, yeah, that's a great idea. We should do more of that. Why didn't we think of this before? There are some things that are just so patently wrong and do not comply, never mind with Christian principles, with the principles of any responsible religion.
Indeed. So in BC, this is certainly a sentiment that we hear anecdotally, but also in poll after poll. I mean, you have almost 50% of people in Vancouver who want to leave because the common perception is that BC is broken. Issue after issue, as you've brilliantly summarized, demonstrates that the province is not working, whether it's on the economic side, affordability, education performance, issue after issue, and the facts show that. So therefore, like so many elections, and you've seen many of them, Nigel, is that this is a change election. And I think that's why, is it fair to say, the BC Conservatives now are in play with the NDP as the incumbent party, because a lot of people would ask the question, is my life better today than it was some 7 or 8 years ago? And most people would say it's worse. So it looks like, in terms of poll projection, that the BC Conservatives have a shot of actually creating a majority government. We will see, but it's a close election. Is that how you see kind of the trend line in terms of what may happen this Saturday?
Well, certainly it's a close election. The polls, frankly, are difficult to interpret. There was a point where the Conservatives appeared to be ahead of the NDP, but as we discussed here at the Western Standard office, there was a strong possibility that they were building up very strong majorities in certain areas, like northeastern BC is not an NDP country. You can win a constituency up there by thousands of votes, which doesn't do you any good if you lose one in the Lower Mainland by a couple of hundred. It's called voter efficiency, and you want a majority
Exactly.
everywhere, not just in some places. So I think we were at that stage a couple of weeks ago where we were really wondering whether the Conservatives might be able to pull this off. As I said, it's hard to interpret the polls, but right now the NDP, I think they went into the election with 55 seats, and the Conservatives had 20 from wherever they got them, from the BC United or some independents getting together. You don't have to be much of a soothsayer to estimate that the Conservatives are going to come up with a very much stronger position than that. But whether they will get the majority, it's 93 seats now. It's going up from 87. There's been some boundary redistribution. And nobody's really got a strong fix on what those extra 6 seats are going to do, for one thing. Are they going to swing this way or that way? But Mr. Eby is going to be, if he does manage to pull this out of the fire, he is going to be facing very much more stronger and organized, clever opposition than what was offered by the BC United Party, which was an awful disappointment for those of us who think conservative thoughts.
Indeed. So that's the state of BC at a high level here. And as we go across the country, we have the next election in New Brunswick on October the 21st. And it's interesting, it's encouraging to see our audience join our conversation with Nigel Hannaford with the Western Standard. Canada RV is from Hanover, Ontario. So a warm welcome to all of you, including Canada RV. So New Brunswick, we've talked a little bit about that election. It's fascinating. It seems very close between the incumbent Conservative Party with Blaine Higgs and then the Liberal Party. Where do you think, what's the key issue here?
Well, perhaps it's because I'm a social conservative, but because of the stand that Blaine Higgs took on on surgery for children who want sex change operations. I think that actually became the issue. People resigned from his cabinet because they didn't agree with him on that. But on the other hand, voters liked what he said, because the idea that a little girl can decide at the age of 10 that she's a little boy and start on that course of transition from one to the other may be popular in some circles, but it's not universally popular. And the easiest thing for Blaine Higgs to have done would have been just been say, well, that's what they're all doing, and carry on and talk about the tides in the Bay of Fundy and how you could generate more hydroelectric power from them, which is an ongoing project. But he didn't. He took a stand. He took a lot of heat. And then the next thing that he had Ford in Ontario backing him up, and then Scott Moe in Saskatchewan backing him up. And finally, probably one of the bravest declarations of them all was Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, who came out and put an age limit on it and said, we love them and we're going to do whatever we can for them, but they're not going to get a sex change operation until they're old enough to make a rational decision on their own. There have been just too many people who had expensive second thoughts, and it's devastating because the damage that's done in these operations is permanent.
Okay, so it's interesting your take on that. So that's one of these differing issues, is weighing in on the SOGI curriculum and that kind of intervention and enabling parental rights, really, to look after their children. Now, it's fascinating. I just noticed, what was it, 2 days ago, the Canadian Society of Pediatricians, I believe, weighed in on a statement because there's been certainly a lot of criticism directed towards the Association of Pediatricians of Canada that they have not really responded incisively to the CAS report in the UK on this topic. So, I mean, that's a much larger discussion, but it's interesting that this is definitely a discussion that's emerging in our country. And so that's the New Brunswick election. Any predictions there, Nigel, or is it too close to call?
It's not that it's too close to call. I'm too far from the action to make a reliable estimate. If you want me to give you a call on Saskatchewan and British Columbia, I will. But New Brunswick, I wish him luck, but I really wouldn't care to place a bet.
All right. So we're curious what the audience thinks. What's your prediction on these elections in BC, New Brunswick, and Saskatchewan? And turning to Saskatchewan, that is a very interesting dynamic. We know Saskatchewan has done relatively well in terms of its economic performance and its way of life. Saskatchewan is certainly one of the very successful provinces in our federation, and it's interesting. It is a history where I believe the Saskatchewan Party's been in power. Is it now 17 years? It's really quite remarkable.
Yes.
So with that kind of successful record, but it's also been a long time, is the dynamic different there in Saskatchewan where you have an incumbent party that's been there a long time, Nigel?
Well, I do actually think it is a dangerous dynamic, because one of the characteristics of Scott Moe and Brad Wall before him was that they are very responsible financial administrators. They're there to do good government.
Mm-hmm.
They like to see the bills paid. They don't like to see debt. Both of them, Brad Wall was fortunate enough to be premier at a time when there was a lot of money being made in Saskatchewan. It's been a tougher haul for Mr. Moe, but again, he is what you would, like he's kind of a dad who keeps an eye on the family finances, and he's not exciting. Those who watched the debate in Saskatchewan, I mean, what I'm picking up is a general sense that Moe had all his numbers right. He had all his arguments right. But his opponent, Carla Beck, the NDP leader, was bright and sassy and said, well, we need change and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. We've got to make better healthcare. The Saskatchewan government under Scott Moe has just hired, I believe it's 273 new doctors. So I guess that's quite a big contribution in a population of 1 million towards improving healthcare. Well, that sort of doesn't mean anything to the NDP. No, everybody's got to wait too long. And so, it's easy to dream big when you are on the outside looking at somebody who's been hacking away at it for 17 years, or at least the party has, not Moe. He's been there since 2017. And, Moe has done a very good job. He has been a strong ally to Alberta, something that matters to us here in the Western Standard and in Alberta. And I don't want to take away from any acclaim that Ms. Beck deserves for her performance in the debate last night. But it's easy to spend money in your dreams. And as one of my columnists wrote in the Western Standard this morning, she promised everything except a unicorn in every backyard. Maybe there's some truth in that, but it's happened before. In fact, it happened at the federal level in 2015 when a very capable prime minister who understood the economy and the big picture in life was displaced by somebody who did not, and in fact boasted that he did not. Oh yes, budgets balance themselves. You'll forgive me if I don't waste too much of my time thinking about monetary policy. These are actual quotes from the prime minister. Well, Mr. Harper thought about those things a lot and understood them, and that's why we had a pretty strong economy in 2015 relative to what we have now today. I know you're talking about Saskatchewan, but I see a parallel between the responsible politician and the pie in the sky NDP candidate who just thinks everything could be better. Just vote for me. Doesn't work.
No, I think that's a good reference, Nigel. Is these As it's been said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does run in rhymes. There's an interesting question from Pipeline Online CA, and it references the Saskatchewan election is a close run thing. And the debate last night saw NDP leader Carla Beck control much of the debate. Clearly, Mo held back compared to his usual brawler method. I think someone told him not to talk over a woman. I think it defanged him. That's Brian Zingchuk. What do you think about that? That's a very interesting question, is it not, Nigel?
Yeah, well, it certainly, you could find plenty of examples where, as you put it, talking over a woman is bad for votes. I mean, the late Jim Prentice, when he was running for Premier of Alberta in 2015, did exactly that. I think he made a patronizing comment about the NDP's mathematical skills. And of course, it was a woman leader. And people said, oh, I don't know whether I like that. And people's votes will change on trivial things like this. People vote on how they feel, and they don't make a sober assessment of who actually knows what they're doing. It's all in the moment. Oh, I think I like that person. I mean, it's a terrible way to pick your vote. If David, I hope you never go into a hospital for serious surgery, but if you ever do, you're going to want the surgeon who is known for his precision. If he happens to be a horrible person, you really don't care. You just want to know that the knife is going where the knife needs to go. If you are traveling on an airplane, you want the pilot who's going to set you down at your destination, not in a town 100 miles away from it. And if he's a horrible person, you don't care as long as he gets you to the right place. So unfortunately, when we go to elect premiers and we choose a prime minister, we are so many of us are so often misled by things that are inconsequential. You know, colored socks, nice hair.
So you don't vote on someone's hair, Nigel? Come on.
She'd have to be really hot. But anyway.
Okay. Well, let us pay attention to that Nigel Hannaford rule. Do not vote just based on someone's hair. Although surely we want a doctor who's not only competent but has good bedside manner. Surely.
Well,
Nigel.
I would like both, but if I have to choose, I will take the guy who's known for 100% accuracy every time.
All right. Yeah, especially with those heart surgeons. Well, those are very good comments. So what do you think, audience? It's very interesting. We've got a lot of comments that are going on here. A lot of predictions. Canada RV suggests New Brunswick, I think, will go conservative. Paul Poco says BC goes conservative. What do you think? What's going to happen in Saskatchewan, Nigel? You have a prediction there?
Yeah, I do. And I think that Scott Moe's government will hold on. And that's not, I make that point not entirely out of sentiment, but also the NDP are going to do in Saskatchewan what the Conservatives are going to do in BC. They're going to build up super majorities in their friendly areas, which are Regina and Saskatoon. So if you're looking at polls coming out of Saskatchewan, and it seems to be very close, keep in mind that those ridings, those constituencies that the NDP is going to win are probably going to be won with very strong majorities. Meanwhile, the countryside belongs to the Saskatchewan party. Now, there's only one thing that I'm aware of that could throw that off, and that is vote splitting on the right. I mean, it's the bane of the Conservative existence. But you do have, what do they call themselves? Sask United.
Oh, yes.
You know, and David, I think these are people that you and I would probably have a very pleasant conversation with. They're described by their critics as right-wing populists. So right away, I know that I know I'm going to like Nadine Wilson, their founder, and she's not leading the party now, but they were formed out of disgust with the way that Scott Moe's government handled COVID. That was the principal generator. They have other ideas as well. if there are a lot of people who are still rankled by how the Saskatchewan party handled COVID, they may just decide to register their protest with by voting with Sask United, and that could cost the party seats without necessarily putting anybody from Sask United in position instead. So that's the one thing that I'm concerned about. I hope people have got more sense. However, I do understand why they're mad. But at the end of it all, I think what we are looking for in Saskatchewan is it takes a 31 for a majority. Right now, the Saskatchewan party has 42. They can afford to lose a few seats and still make power, and I think that's the way that's going to go.
Okay, so pay attention to Nigel's projection there. It's a very fascinating question. And I have a number of questions for you, Nigel, as follow up to our really interesting discussion here. One is the whole tendency, it seems, that the NDP it appears to be stronger, or left of center political parties seem to be stronger, dare I say, socialist kind of parties within urban areas. And it's rural areas that tend to go conservative. Now, this isn't always the case. I think of in Vancouver, that's certainly the bedrock place for the NDP in this election in BC. But having said that, there's a lot of ridings that are in play. In fact, David Eby, the incumbent premier, may even lose his site in Point Grey in Vancouver. That's how tight this election is.
Well,
But what's your thesis on why people kind of shake out between rural and urban areas? What's your theory on that, Nigel?
Well, I don't have a universal explanation, but I can offer you some thoughts. First of all, to your point about David Eby, that was Christy Clark's
It was.
constituency
Yes.
before he had it. So it was somewhat of an aberration for that seat to go NDP in the first place. If it returns to the Conservative fold, I don't think that's a cause for a huge surprise. There was a similar situation years ago when Oak Bay, of all places on God's green earth, went to the Green Party. But then Andrew Weaver, who was the candidate there,
Right.
you could hardly meet a more conservative gentleman. Used to be a rugby player, I mean, he's not a woke wuss. He's a guy I didn't agree with him, but when I met him, I came out of it just thinking, well, what a decent fellow. And so I can see how sometimes the individual can make the difference. And if Oak Bay can choose Andrew Weaver and then go back to a conservative candidate, which is the same thing can happen in Point Grey. To your larger point about what makes rural people conservative, I'm not sure that that's universally the case. The NDP came out of the CCF, which in Saskatchewan was a rural party. But then when you look at the CCF, it is nothing like the NDP today. I mean, the things that the NDP stands for would have been rejected by the founders of the CCF, Tommy Douglas and people like that would never have stood for it. So it's sometimes conservatism can be expressed in more than one way. There is certainly a lot of people who go to live in rural areas just want to get away from everything. They want a bit of space around them. They tend to be independent. They know if the power goes off, they're going to have to take care of it themselves and look after their neighbors as well. That's a very conservative way of looking at things. And so you tend to be attracted to common sense conservatives who just say things like they are, and that's exactly right. Way to go. There is also in the urban areas, if you think a tendency to look to government rather than yourself or your neighbor if something goes wrong. That certainly favors politicians who promise you the world.
The other question that I think is a very interesting dynamic in a number of these elections is the strength of the federal conservative brand, and how is that rubbing off on other political parties. Now, I noticed that in the BC election, there was an effort, actually a legal challenge by the NDP to try to change at the last minute the naming on the actual electoral ballot from away from conservative to include the word BC conservative, because of course the Polyev juggernaut is rolled across the country. I mean, it's stunning the the poll strength of those numbers in Canada. The NDP, by the way, in BC failed with that challenge to change the name on the ballot to BC Conservative. So now it is just simply Conservative. But is that federal brand, the strength of it, rubbing off, and is it playing a dynamic in these elections, do you think, Nigel?
Yes, I do. It shouldn't, but it does. The BC Liberal Party, when it existed as such, suffered quite heavily from being confused with the Federal Liberal Party. And it's only if you can confuse the party of Wilkinson with the party of Trudeau, then you can certainly confuse the party of Rustad with the party of Polyev. You're into politics, David. I'm into politics. We make those distinctions. Somebody says, well, what about the pothole in my back alley? And you know right away, well, we're not even talking about your that, sir. That's for your city council, not for the federal government. Oh, is it? Oh, okay. And so people who have analyzed politics at that level probably can get things mixed up. I don't know that that's going to make all the difference for Mr. Rustad, in BC. Boy, they have their own brand of weed, and who knows how they think. But there I go. I've just blown the whole interview, insulted the whole province. But people are. I think Rustad's going to have some reflected glory from Mr. Polyev.
All right. So what do you think, audience? Is Nigel right that there's some, quote, reflected glory from the federal conservative brand onto these other parties? It's a very interesting point. And I suspect you're right, Nigel, that that's just a natural part because, these policy issues are complex, and there's a lot of, people who are going about, what is it again? Oh yeah, their daily lives, just trying to survive and work, raise their families, do a good job. And so, yeah, I think you're right. A lot of people don't pay close attention to what's going on. What about the role of the media in these elections? Have you noticed some patterns there? I mean, I think that we could all comment that the legacy media is overwhelmingly, left of center, but is that a fair comment? I mean, you're at the Western Standard. You see this kind of reporting by others all the time. Any observations there? What kind of role they're playing in these elections?
It's probably less of a role than they think they are playing. Readership in the mainstream media is sharply down. Trust in the mainstream media is sharply down. The one thing that what we call the mainstream media, which is the sort of the heritage newspaper titles, like the Vancouver Sun, the Calgary Herald, the Edmonton Journal, the Globe and Mail, the one power they still retain is to validate an issue as an issue. So if a small paper, all right, we'll use the Western Standard as an example. If the Western Standard gets a scoop about something that is really happening, it's not until another newspaper or the CBC or the CTV or Global endorses that and says, yes, this really did happen, that then becomes an issue of national concern. But I'll give you a very specific example, a very recent example. 2 weeks ago, October the 7th, there was a demonstration in Vancouver in which Canadian flags were burned. At that demonstration, hostile crowds chanted, "We are Hamas, we are Hezbollah." One of our reporters caught that on tape.
Indeed.
And he
Yes.
wrote the story, and we had it, and we put it out there. And our readers, of course, responded with outrage,
Hmm.
and nobody else did for about 2 days because it
Yeah,
took
no, that was
the
fascinating.
mainstream media that long to catch up
Hmm.
and say, yeah, that really did happen. They used our footage and gave us credit for it, which is how things are done. And, we don't have any axe to grind about that. Everything was proper, but until somebody in a traditional media said, yes, this is really an issue, this has happened, and then of course you got the everything that happened in Parliament thereafter. So you're coming back then to what you're asking about elections. How much influence do you think the mainstream media will have? Well, if it is somebody who has said something terribly silly and terribly offensive to the generally progressive slash woke common denominator of the mainstream media, they'll pick it up and they'll play it up. I don't know who reads it. The circulation numbers and the viewership numbers are not good, but they certainly will try to do their traditional role of supporting the left.
Hmm.
They will not do much to advance the cause of conservative groups when they make a good point. They'll just wait until somebody says something silly. So they have an influence, but it's not what it was. So if you say the Vancouver Sun endorses, I don't know, but I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know who they're going to endorse, but whoever it is, nobody's going to care.
Yeah, I think you're right, Nigel, is that there is an interesting influence happening with legacy media, but it is far diminished, as certainly the so-called rising stars, the independents like the Western Standard, really have major audiences now, and you have people on the ground in all these settings looking critically at these issues. And we're thankful that you did pick up on that film. It was video footage of that incredible, outrageous incident of that group, that terrorism group, burning the Canadian flag is really should be a wake up call across our country.
Well, when you've got a group of people, it's one thing to say we're Hamas. I think it's a silly thing to say, but
Hmm.
if you then go on and say death to Canada, which was the other thing that came out of that demonstration,
Indeed, yeah,
that ought to be a stimulus for action by the government. I kind of thought Mr. Eby's response to that was tepid. He said the right thing, but he didn't say it very loudly, and he waited too long to say it.
right on. Yeah, so we cannot take our country for granted as we look at so many of these groups who have played an active role on the assault of not only people internationally, in the case of Israel, but also in the case of Canada, with all kinds of examples, outrageous examples of anti Semitism. Our country has a tradition of healthy, respectful debate and discussion. And again, we cannot take that for granted. Well, look, I want to thank you so much, Nigel, for joining us, along with our active audience who have tabled many brilliant comments and questions about our upcoming elections in BC on October the 19th, in New Brunswick, October 21, and of course, Saskatchewan on October the 28th. You've offered, I think, some brilliant points and analysis, and we look forward to having you on again soon.
That would be my pleasure. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank you to our audience for joining us today. And please be sure to like us and pass on this discussion. These are important discussions that we talk about every week here on the Frontier, and next Thursday is no exception, so please join us next week. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.